Hi, welcome to my show. Today I have someone who was actually my first guest on the show ever, about almost a year and a half ago, Dr. Stan Williams. Welcome back.
Thank you, Al. I'm glad to be here.
And I think you were a good luck because it's kept going.
Hey,
I haven't.
You've done a lot of shows.
Yes.
What is this, number 55 now?
55, yes, yes.
Good.
So you've been good luck, and thank you. And we've actually, over this time period, we've worked on several things. We formed a nonprofit organization, Unique Voices in Films. And recently, you did this incredible major work with a script that I've been working on that had been quarterfinalist at the Academy Nichols Fellowship and the Francis Coppola, his contest. So when you found out about that, you realized it needs some improvement and revisions. And we went through this workshop that was amazing, and it was based on your book, The Moral Premise. So when was this book released right here?
The book was written in 2005. It was released in 2006 by Michael Wiese Productions or Books. Yeah.
Yeah, and I went on that production. They really publish great quality work.
They were my favorite. I mean, I've been reading film books for years, and they were my favorite publisher of film books. And so when we ended up writing The Moral Premise, they were the first person I sent it to. And literally 48 hours after I submitted it, they said, we'd love to publish it. And so it was kind of like picked up almost overnight. And they had minor changes to it, but then my writing partner actually made the biggest suggestion, and so we ended up adding a whole chapter to it because of a writing partner, a friend of mine I had. But yeah, it's pretty... It's been very successful. It's been very helpful to a lot of writers all over the world.
And I know the last time that you were here, you talked about the little story with Will Smith. So I'm going to have you repeat it because it's a very inspirational story, and it says a lot about this book. And because now when I'm going to explain how effective it was, when we went through my script, people can actually, I mean, Will Smith, what happened, that story, tell them, and then we'll go into the other stuff.
How Will Smith found me or something like that? Is that what you mean?
Yes, through this book. Yeah.
This was in 2007, a year. It was about 6-8 months after the book was released. Mm-hmm. And I was sitting at my desk in Northville, Michigan, working on something that at the moment, didn't have anything particular to do with film. And I got a phone call from a young lady, and she says, are you Stan Williams, and you're not in San Quentin? Are you on death row? And I said, no, I'm in Northville. And I said, why? Is there a Stanley Williams on death row in San Quentin? She said, yes, Stanley Tukey Williams, the gang leader. And I didn't realize it at the time, but he has the same name as I do.
Okay.
And she said, so I'm glad you're not in prison, and I'm glad you're in Michigan because my boss read your book, and he loves it, and he wants to talk to you. I said, oh, that's great. Who's your boss? And she said, very nonchalantly, she said, Will Smith. Now, you have to understand, I'm sitting in Northville. I'm not thinking about movies. And this came as such a surprise. And, of course, I recognized the name, but it was like subliminally buried in the back of my brain. And I had no idea who she was talking about, but I knew it was someone I should know. And I said, oh, yeah. What's the name of his production company? And I immediately put my hands on my keyboard, and she said, Overbrook Entertainment. And I immediately typed that in, and up came Overbrook Entertainment. And I thought, that's that Will Smith. So she tried to connect us so he could talk to me that day or the next day, but he was traveling, couldn't. She had a hard time finding me. As it turned out, a few weeks later, they sent me a couple scripts to read and asked my comments to review them and to do some sort of analysis on them, which I did. And the next thing I knew, they were asking me to come to L.A., and look at another project that they were working on that was in the editing room. And so anyhow, that started maybe a 3.5, 4-year experience with Overbrook and with Will, where I ended up working on about 13 of his projects. Only about a third of those actually got made, though. So even Will Smith has a hard time getting movies made. Yeah.
Well, so what was it in particular that he liked about the book? What areas of it? And then we'll go a little bit about how your workshops that you do and the consults.
The concept of the moral premise, and this is what I think everyone really likes about it. The concept of the moral premise is that it tells you what the internal motivations are for all the main characters in any story, in any media. It's not just film-based. And so you end up formulating a moral premise statement. In fact, you've got a slide of the moral premise statement somewhere, if I could bring it up. This will explain it.
Between one and...
Well, the one with the brackets. Well, that's good. Let's start there. Let's go back. Go back.
So
let's start there.
Yeah.
So the concept of the moral premise is going to direct every creative element in the story, whether it be a film, novel, or stage play, or even a short story. And so we see here that we're talking about a moral physical premise statement. And this is the statement that unites the inner and the outer journey of all your main characters. But we can talk most specifically about the protagonist or the hero. Mm-hmm. And so what we have there is we have this psychological motivation that leads to some action or some outward action. And so we end up, see at the top there's some psychological motivation or value, some value leads to some physical action or something that happens physically. So for instance, your viewers, for instance, they made a psychological decision of value to say, I'm going to watch Wiam's show today. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's something that happens in the brain first, but then it takes place in the physical world when they do something. We say that all human beings have some sort of set of values in their brain. Those values cause them to make some sort of decision. That decision enters the physical world as an action, and then the consequence of the action is something that they don't control. Natural law controls that. Mm. And so they learn through the use of the moral premise by making decisions and taking action and then seeing the consequence. They end up discovering, does this work? Is this going to lead me to happiness? Because ultimately our happiness is the consequence of living in synchronization with nature. Mm-hmm. And if we're not stepping off a cliff, right?
Right.
Nature's going to take us and hurt us if we step off the cliff. But if we're smart and we stay, on top of the cliff, we're not going to hurt ourselves. So that's about, we make a decision and we take an action. Do we step back from the cliff or do we step over the cliff? And that results in either some detriment to our lives or some betterment, we save. So go back to that slide again. So we have some, so all
before
stories.
This?
Yeah,
this
is okay. This is a good slide.
Okay.
So all stories are the consequence or are the result of some moral conflict, thus the moral premise. And that moral conflict is based on a set of values. In this case, on the far left, in the middle line there, you see some vice versus some virtue. So if we live with some vice or we are motivated by a vice or a weakness in our lives, mm-hmm. that's going to lead to some physical detriment. Mm-hmm. Something bad's going to happen. Mm-hmm. But if we're motivated by some virtue or character strength, that's going to lead to some physical betterment. Something good's going to happen. Mm-hmm. Now, this is obvious, right? It sounds really simple. If you're bad, something bad's going to happen. If you're good, something good's going to happen. Mm-hmm. But it's really subtle and it's very sophisticated because it applies to every action in the movie. It applies to every character. So if you go back to that slide where we have at the bottom, so the movie everyone's probably familiar with, Liar, Liar. The value here is that Jim Carrey's character wants to be deceptive. He's always lying. Mm-hmm. So a deceptive heart leads to rejection. Mm-hmm. Well, he's rejected by his clients. He's rejected by his wife. He's rejected by his kids, right? He's rejected by the bank. Mm-hmm. And when he gets his life turned around and through the magic that his son experiences, he learns to tell the truth. Mm-hmm. that turns his life around, and then that leads to acceptance. So he gets back with his wife, with his kids, he gets his job back, and the whole thing. So that's the moral premise concept. And I think that what Will liked about it, well, what everyone likes about it, is that when you're struggling with a story and you want to know what's the story really about. I mean, we can say that Die Hard's about a New York cop fighting a tower full of terrorists from Europe, in L.A. But what it's really about is how John McClane's love for his wife dies hard. That's psychologically what's going on inside. So that movie is talking about how John McClane is very arrogant at the beginning of the movie. And as a consequence, he gets in trouble. But when he learns to humble himself and sacrifice himself for the good of others, he gets his wife back, and everything else.
Now, I saw this on the videos that you have on your website, The Moral Premise, and I hadn't looked at it that way before. I mean, you're right. So on a deeper level, psychologically, there's something deeper that connects us to the story.
Right.
But we don't really recognize that. And I know that even when you were helping with my revise the script, really some of these important factors, it's not so easy to tap into. When I read the book, it makes so much sense, and I see where you're coming from. But then when we sat and worked on the book, we have I have this thing right here. We want this diamond shape. I mean,
this is called the story diamond.
That's a story. Yeah. That was so intense, and we came out really. I saw everything that you're describing in the book. Is it possible to read the book and be able to apply that, or do you? I mean, I felt like sitting with you was a totally different experience. Of course, I mean, and that, isn't that also? It's almost like dealing with an editor. I've usually worked more so with books, and with my editors, we work very closely. We go back and forth with the manuscript so many times, and I felt this was that in depth. So it kind of. Do you actually need somebody to work with? It seems like you do.
Yeah, you do. It helps. What I tried to do, I might show you. This is the book, The Art of Dramatic Writing by Lagos Egri.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's shown.
That when I was working on my doctorate in narrative theory, which technically it's not, but that's practically what all my research was on, I ended up reading dozens and dozens of books on story structure. Mm-hmm. And this is one of the books that kind of resonated with me. This book is still in print. Lagos Egri was a story theorist that worked in Hollywood. He actually worked in Europe. He's from Europe, but he worked in Hollywood for a while. Ended up writing this book, and this book is being released still by Simon Schuster and Disney and stuff. Well, what Lagos Egri does, he hits on this truth that all stories are about some moral premise at their core. Although he just simply calls it the premise, but he doesn't tell you how to do it. And he doesn't tell you in the book, it doesn't apply to film or movies. It applies to screenplay, it applies to Greek plays and some obscure Broadway plays, but he doesn't talk about one movie in the book. Well, we're in a culture today that, it's motion pictures and stuff. So what I did, I decided that I could kind of do a sequel to this, and that's when I wrote The Moral Premise. And The Moral Premise takes the principal concept that Lagos Egri started with, and it explains it in terms of motion pictures. And then the second half of the book is a how-to section. It literally takes you step by step to step. It's kind of somewhat of an anal, linear way how to do it. Mm-hmm. Now, what I keep telling writers, like I've told you this and many others, is that although the book and the story diamond and some of the other techniques that I have when I consult with writers, they're kind of linear in nature. In reality, the writer is such a creative entity that you can't follow things exactly step by step by step by step. It's an iterative process. You may come up with a great ending and then work your way backwards to it. Or you may, some people come up with a great moment of grace, we call it. It's the midpoint. Mm-hmm. And they work the way from that. So you have log lines, you have treatments, you have scripts, you have structure, all these different aspects of a story. And there is a way to think about it logically. And I have those on my blog, and I have those in the book.
Yes, you have a lot of information available for people.
There's over 200 articles in story how do you say that?
Analysis?
Analysis of movies.
Okay, yeah. Well, you taught film too. That's I forgot to mention. So originally, how
We met,
I know
yeah.
we met
Right.
is that you were you taught at MPI, Motion Picture Institute of Michigan, and this was I was a student from 2004 and 2005, and so you were very supportive at that time, and you saw that I was really trying. I was a writer. I'm still mostly, that's
Right.
my area, but you were very supportive of what I was trying to do at the time. And then you and your wife came to some of the cultural events that we had
Yeah, right.
with our organization and stuff like that. So it was kind of just, and you've met some of the writers that I, entertained. So that's how it originally started. So you've been teaching this as well. So it's not just that you work with films, but you've taught it as
Right,
well. Yeah.
right. Well, shortly after we came up with the book, I was asked to start giving workshops, and so the first couple workshops I gave on the book and the process of structuring your film so it's about one thing and making sure all your characters are in line and they're in the theme. The moral premise is actually the theme, and you have a positive aspect to the theme, which is the virtues and the strengths, and then you have the negative aspects of the theme, which are the polar opposite vices and weaknesses. And so when you understand that all stories are a conflict of internal values in people's heads and how those things are personified in the actions that they take, and so the actions that we see on screen really become metaphors for what's going on in people's heads. So people wanted to understand that. So I started teaching those in workshops, like one-day workshops in
Yes.
colleges. And then ended up going to L.A. and giving workshops out there and a lot. So I've done a lot of workshops, but then I've taught at a graduate level at Wayne State a little bit as an adjunct and at MPI. And then I also took a bunch of teenagers through a 2-year story symposium effort. So
That was
I've done a
fun,
lot of
yeah.
teaching. Yeah.
Well, and I'm trying to get you to do a workshop for the Path of Consciousness Spiritual and Writing Retreat.
Right, you
which is
mentioned
in,
that,
Yeah,
yeah.
which is in October. So, because really, your workshop is very effective. I mean, what we did, it's different with the script that I'm working on.
Well,
because
it's specific.
it was very specific, and I
yeah.
got to tell you, I've done that with books where I've gone through such in depth with that, but I've never done that with a script before, and it was I felt like if I would have just had done this before submitting it to these festivals where it was quarterfinalists, like it makes a big difference. I mean, where it was to what we turned it into, it made a
Right.
very big difference. So I have another there's other,
these are
yeah.
just some other examples of moral premise statements. So like Terminator 2, this is where Arnold lowers himself into the vat of molten lead to destroy the chip inside his head. It's selfishness leads to death, but sacrifice leads to life. Or in James Bond, all the James Bond movies are essentially the pursuit of power leads to defeat, but the pursuit of justice leads to success. And Where the Heart is based on a famous book, and it's not very well known as a movie, but it made a good movie. Sally Fields was in it. Relying on fate leads to despair, but relying on free will leads to hope. And you'll notice that in each one of those, the values that are on the left, selfishness and sacrifice and so forth, they're polar opposite values. And so those are the values that are in the character's head. So if you have a protagonist fighting an antagonist, you have, like in the James Bond movie, James Bond is always pursuing justice, where the bad guy is always pursuing power. And so you have those opposite values that then result in the physical action. And the physical action then becomes the metaphor for what's going on inside people's heads. So we can say what something is about, and that's the physical story. And then we say what something is really about, and that's the psychological story or the value story, the moral premise story.
And then we have this right here. This is what we went through. It was a little bit, it seems a little bit complicated.
Yeah,
but once we started breaking things down with the script, I really understand the importance of each area.
So the whole idea, this does look complicated, but if you look at just to the color dots on that black line, you'll notice that they're pretty evenly spaced all along. So the story begins at the far left and it ends at the far right. And you see we have Act 1, 2, and 3. Well, the whole idea of creating a story structurally is that you have a regular emotional roller coaster going, so that the audience is constantly on their seats. Is he going to succeed or is he going to fail? It's like the proverbial picking the daisy. He loves me not. He loves me not.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're constantly wondering as an audience, are they going to get together or are they going to split? Are they going to get together or going to split? Or the boy gets the girl, the boy loses the girl, back and forth. So the idea of that diagram was that you are constantly, those dots indicate specific things that happen that either the protagonist does or the antagonist does, and you end up with this roller coaster effect, which is symbolized by the blue line at the very bottom. You notice how it goes up and down and up and down.
Mm-hmm.
And that green line shows you the general slope of the story, where it kind of goes down and it gets depressing, but then it ends on a high note. If you ever
and I believe that on your website, or you showed me that you were you used the film to kind of show an example of that.
You can show that, yeah.
Isn't that on your website as well?
Well,
I mean, you go into more details. You
there are some posts on my blog.
Mm-hmm.
It's the blog that has the analysis that describes some of that, but it mostly does it in my workshop. In my workshops, I show the clips. Oh, I know what you're thinking of. You're thinking about the workshop online. I have an online workshop.
That's what it is. Yes, you showed me something, and I remember it was let me see.
So
Storycraft. That's what it is.
Storycraft
training.
Right.
Yes.
Storycraft training is a 7-hour, 10-episode. It's essentially my 2-day workshop. That's narrowed down into 7 hours. So you can buy this online.
That's kind of what
you can rent it.
It took us that long. Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And there are all kinds of clips in this. So there's all kinds of there's all kinds of examples.
Yeah. Just put it up a little bit.
Yeah.
Storycraft training.
Yeah.
Yes.
So Storycraft, the blog site, well, you can just go to moralpremise.com.
When they go there, then they can see
and there's a link
how
there.
Okay.
But it's storycrafttraining.blogspot.com. And then that links then to Vimeo, where there's
videos and training.
It's a pay-on-demand sort of thing. So you can either rent them individually or buy the whole package and download it so you can have it forever.
There's different,
Yeah, and so a lot of people love it, yeah.
Yeah, well, like I said, that was very intense. I mean, I got so much out of it, and it really helped my script. I mean, it went from, so sometimes you feel like you have a great story, and then it's just, well, you have all this at the action, but really knowing how to pace it, you can see that it flows more smoothly. You, as a writer, even become more familiar with the characters.
Right.
You get to know them more in and out. I mean, I really found it very helpful. And there was another thing. It's the Story Diamond, which I wanted to go.
Well, the Story Diamond.
Yeah,
this is the Story Diamond.
And that's kind of what we. That's when you had me do put all these.
This has go back to your picture of you.
Yeah, so this is the story.
That's you working on the Story Diamond. I have a 4x8 sheet piece of masonite on rollers with a PVC frame that I roll in front of the desk so we can work on it. We put up Post-it notes. So now go back to the other picture of the Story Diamond. So this Story Diamond, you'll notice all the different colors, and you'll notice all the text around the edges. This demonstrates, and by the way, anybody can download this for free on my website. So it's under this Writing Aids tab on moralpremise.com.
Okay.
And you can download, as well as an explanation about it.
Oh, great.
But what this is that you see all the different colors. Every different color around the diamond, as well as around the perimeter, you see circles and squares. All of these represent a different story theory that some story guru has written about in a book. And you realize and this is what I did after studying this stuff for years, that regardless of which story guru or book you're picked up, if it's a reputable book, it's talking about the same thing. It's just looking at it from a different perspective.
So you're saying that you can even, because that's what I noticed when I was reading this, so you can apply this to fiction. This is just to any story. This is not limited to feature films, although this is...
It's easier to talk about in feature films because they're short and you can see it.
Yeah.
But it applies to novels. I work with novelists as well. I've worked with a number of novelists.
Yes.
And, of course, the scope is much bigger, but the arc is pretty much the same. But the idea is that regardless of which book that you've read, and you say this person talks about the 4 stages of the movie, this person talks about the 5 acts, or this person talks about 3 acts, or Blake Snyder talks about 15 beat points. Michael Haig talks about 13. Regardless, those all lay on top of each other. They're all talking about the same thing because good stories, there's a natural law to good stories. It's like the proverbial guy runs away from the bad guy and ups a tree, and then there's the guy on the ground throws rocks at the guy in the tree, then the guy comes down out of the tree and chases the guy off. Well, that's like, I'm in trouble, I do something, I get out of trouble. It's a story of our lives. It's how we all deal. You deal with a problem, you find a solution, and you end up being successful. That's the story of every project and everything we do. So there's a natural flow to storytelling. And the moral premise, the story diamond, and as well as that horizontal diagram. The horizontal diagram, by the way, and the story diamond are identical in terms of concept. They're just 2 different ways of looking at it. That and the story diamond are really the same. They're just 2 different ways of explaining it out.
Well, and there's so much that people can, by visiting the moral premise page, that there's just so many tools for them that they can use, including videos and everything like that. And I think maybe in some cases they can work with you if there's that possibility.
I have writers over, not just you, but I had a writer over today working on a children's book.
Yeah.
So I work with writers based on a fee. Whether they be distant and they email me or will we get by phone. I mean, a lot of times I ended up going to L.A. to work with people, but sometimes they email me and send me a script, and we'll do it over the phone.
You'll work with them,
or we'll just do it by writing. Yeah.
Or in person. Then they can
if they're locally, we get them together, and we can get them in front of the story diamond and actually beat the story out. But when I go to L.A. and I work with some producers out there, that's exactly what we do. They either have the story diamond or they have some sort of chart, and we literally take Post-it notes and put them on glass door walls, and beat things out for 2 or 3 days in a row.
And how long have you been doing this?
Since 2007, I guess.
2007. Yeah. Well, it seems like, I guess because you taught before that, so you've really been involved in this business for a very long time. And I know you do a million other things as well. I know you're a very busy man, but you are really dedicated to this. And I know that working on my script with you was just very helpful. My script has really made such a big turnaround. So I'm glad that you were able to make it here again. I'm sure that I'll have you here. I'm sure we'll work on more things, and then you'll end up here somehow or another. I'll bring you back because I think that what you teach is very useful. That's another reason. I think I told you that last time we were talking about a film that you were working on, but this time I said, this was so helpful. Can you come and share this with the audience? So I really appreciate that you came here, and I'll have you back. Okay.
Thanks, Vial.
Okay. Thank you.